Archamen.
And thanks for staying with us. Let's now turn attention to the telecommunications sector, where the tariff hike is coming days after Communications Minister Bosun Tijani said Telecom's tariff hike won't be more than 60% of the current rate. In a statement, a spokesman for the regulator, Ruben Moka, said the price adjustment, though lower than the over 100% requested by some network operators, was arrived at by taking into account ongoing industry reforms that would positively influence sustainability. The regulator said the increase was pursuant to its power under Section 108 of the Nigerian Communications Act 2003 to regulate and approve tariff rates and charges by telecommunications operators. In the meantime, the Nigerian Labour Congress has criticized the federal government for approving a 50% increase in telecommunication tariffs, threatening strike. Now let's address all of these issues. We have the Managing Director of Adio Strategy and Communications. He joins me for more on this development. Good to have you join us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so this has become a point of conversation in the country, reactions for and against. We've seen several organizations saying, we're going to court or we're threatening strike. Initially, it was 100% that was requested. Eventually, it was, the Minister of Communications did say it was going to be between 30 and 60, now it's 50. Almost like they have met, at the midpoint. What's your thought on that?
Well, I mean, firstly, I was expecting that obviously what will be implemented would have been closer to 50% than it would have been to the 30% window that was given when the minister spoke. So it's not surprising that they've arrived at 50%, which is some sort of a fair balance if you looked at it. If, in the negotiation table, if you got half of what you were requesting for, I think you take that home happily. So I would say that they arrived at a midpoint that will not push the consumers to the edge and will also give the telcos some sort of operating room to keep their heads above water. So it's a bit of a fair balance, a thin line that was found within the 50% increase. And I think that should be sustainable enough for the telcos, and that should not be as devastating as it would have been if the rise was about 100% for the consumers.
So a lot of people, when they hear you say that it will not push the consumers over the edge, would wonder, that that's not true, because it is not just this particular tariff. They've been increasing all the tariffs. And so when you put all of them together, it does push the consumer over the edge, doesn't it? No,
I didn't say it doesn't push the consumer. I said it doesn't push them as much as it would have if it was 100% increase in the tariff. So at 50%, it's a lot more reasonable than you would have imagined if it was increased to about 100%, which clearly would have pushed, a lot of consumers over the edge. Now, while this places an extra burden on consumers, the reality is the telcos also operate within the same economy that everybody's operating with. And I'm sure you have reviewed your ad prices upwards. So has every newspaper in the country done. I have gotten, their news price list. So media organizations have raised rates up. Restaurants have raised rates up. Hotels have done the same. Transporters have done the same. So I think it's a bit unfair for us to expect telcos to keep their prices low after well over a decade, given the cost environment where prices have suddenly skyrocketed, and their key inputs, their major inputs, whether you talk of energy, diesel, petrol, electricity, and the things that they import into the country, which has been exposed to, the devaluation of our currency, you just have to understand the fact that there's no way they can continue to operate at a loss, and of course the 50% becomes, relatively fair. I mean, I would imagine that I would have preferred 30% increase. But if you looked at it and you're being honest and brutally honest with the facts, you will see that 50% is some sort of middle ground that has been found between pushing the consumers to the extreme and allowing the telcos to continue to operate, favorably.
But couldn't this increase have been staggered? Some have said, look, we'd have done maybe 15, 15, 15 over a 3-year period, or 20, 20, 10 over a 3-year period. It just depends. But over even a 6 months period, instead of doing, just a complete leap to 50%.
The pharmacy where I buy antibiotics from did not stagger their prices over 3-6 months for me. I went to the shop one morning and the prices had gone up by over 200%. The person you buy bread from down the road did not stagger the increase in prices over 6 months. You went to buy bread or eggs the next morning and the prices had gone up by over 100%. So I'm sort of wondering, where the moral ground is, for the telcos here, because they are also a business. They are a business concern. They deal with costs, the same costs that the bakers deal with, the same costs that the pharmacy deals with. So how do we have so much compassion for the pharmacy who raises prices by over 300%, and then we want to take to the streets for the telcos who have done so after several negotiations to raise their own prices by 50%? I think it's a bit unfair, because on the one hand, we seem to be accepting of the fact that fuel prices can suddenly be removed on the first speech of the president, and the prices can go, from as low as 200 to as high as 640. And we seem to be understanding of that reality, but somehow we are not.
I'm not sure people are understanding of that reality, because
business.
The conversation is still ongoing. There are people who feel that whatever must be done, should be done to ensure that prices, come back to what it used to be, at least close to what it used to be before. And there are certain, people in certain quarters who now are a bit optimistic because of the refineries that are, working. And so maybe that's the reason some people have said, okay, let's see how this plays out. And for pharmacy, I'm not sure people are accepting, because
you have to buy.
you do have to buy. And there is no central regulator for that sector compared to the telecommunications, where the government seemed to have a bit of control. And that's why people are saying, look, if you made a policy that threw us into this situation, perhaps you should have had, compassion enough to make this staggered in a way that we can, plus power, the tariff and everything, in a way that we can all manage with lean resources, since it hasn't increased in over, resources haven't increased over years as well.
So going by your analysis, obviously the government has the bigger bully pulpit here, because they are the ones who raise electricity tariffs, right? They are the ones who raise the cost of petrol. They are the ones who have, implemented policies that has led to a cost-push inflation in our economy, right? So the onus in this argument that we're making now should have been on the government to say, okay, fine, if I want telcos to keep prices down, perhaps we should give them special exchange rate regime. Perhaps we should, give them petrol at discounted rates. Perhaps we should sell electricity to them at discounted rates, and then they can keep prices low. But the reality is that you have not done that. You suddenly want to push the entire burden, to a business concern to take all of those hits. Last year, MTN, for instance, had a forex exchange loss of close to 900 billion. Airtel did about $260 million in foreign exchange loss. So these companies are taking significant hits. And you must realize that when we put out figures of growth in the economy, the sector that is driving the growth in the economy is the service sector. And the businesses that are leading those growth is the telcos and the banks, right? So if the telcos continue to shrink, if we continue to create an environment, a regulatory environment where you stifle the growth of the telecommunications sector, it means it would have a reverberating effect on the economy, and our economy is likely to stagnate. That also means that, they would have to retrench workers, and that's extremely bad for the economy. So while I am extremely understanding of the impact that it will have on you and I, because we have to pay more for calls, we have to pay more for data, I think what the concern at this moment should be is what the regulators are doing to ensure that we're getting the best value from what we'll be paying going forward, and to extract as much concessions as they can. And the idea that
and that's what I wanted to speak with you about, because we spoke to that was on Thursday when we spoke to the CEO MTN Nigeria, and he had talked about focusing on the increase in quality of service, and that he was sure that the NCC was going to hold them accountable in that regard. And I'm wondering again, how do they meet, especially for businesses who also depend on this networks for their business, small businesses actually do. Yeah. What sort of services can they render to take off that burden of also increasing cost for small businesses?
Well, it's hard to speak for for MTN, for instance, or for Airtel. I'm not sure what kind of product innovation they're doing within the organization, and I cannot speak to that. But what I do know is if in the last 3-4 months, for instance, when you buy an unlimited data, after 2 weeks, your so-called unlimited data that was supposed to take you for 30 days gets exhausted, and you have to sort of recharge before the end of the month. So what the regulators need to ensure now is that if you're selling an unlimited bundle to the consumer, that unlimited bundle must be unlimited and expires on the 30-day period that you have promised that consumer. So these are the kinds of things that I expect the regulator to hold these telcos to account to. And some of these sharp practices that some of them do, where you try to recharge, they sort of burden you with so many other options. And then you don't know when you press 2 or you press 3, and you buy more than you thought you wanted to buy.
And those pop-up messages.
And those pop-up messages and things like that that are exactly, all of those practices that are, designed to get the consumer to buy more and induce you to buy what you never really expected to buy. Those are the things that I expect the regulator to be front burner with and ensure that, they push the telcos, to desist from all those kinds of sharp practices and to deliver, on their promises or the promises that they make to the consumers. And that way, we just may be able to see a bit of shift in the cost that we're supposed to absorb. Because really and truly, if I'm paying 20,000 naira for an unlimited bundle for a month, and midway into, I have to renew that again, and I'm now in a situation where I have to pay 30,000 for that bundle, and it can run me through the entire month. You see that somehow I have a cost savings of 10,000 naira because the quality has gone up, and the regulators have held them to account to keep the promises that they are making to the consumers. So that for me is where I want the regulators to be a lot more upfront.
Just to add to that, because there's this practice of, buy, I think there was one that I subscribed to one time where it was, buy 15,000, I think instead of buying 11,000, then pay 15,000 for, so instead of 40 gig, you get 80 gig.
Yeah.
And then you just realize that what you get actually is still the 40 gig. In fact, I never saw that 40 gig.
Exactly. So those are the things, you see, those are the things that that's the work of the regulator. That's where we should see them do their jobs and rise up to the occasion. Really and truly, if you asked me, the regulator is not supposed to be in the business of price controls. But let's give it that, they have negotiated a 50% price hike. But where the job needs to be done is to deal with things like this. If you say I'm going to get an extra 40 gig, whether it's a bonanza, whether it's whatever you call it, I have to get that extra 40 gig. And if I don't get that gig, I should have the opportunity to lay a complaint where the provider can be held accountable for deceiving the consumer, out of his own money. And those other sharp practices also have to be dealt with upfront. So that way, consumers can get a better deal from telcos. And I can assure you that would absorb many of the costs that we currently deal with. Because now we're pretending to ourselves. We all know that we're not getting the value for what we're paying for at the moment. We know that somehow, some way, when we recharge, we don't make as much calls as we used to, and things like that. We seem to observe that. So now that you've now agreed to raise these prices, we must get the services for which we're paying.
And we see that, both the Minister of Aviation and Aerospace and the NCA are trying to achieve that, in the aviation sector, where customers get the value for their money. And if you say you're going by 2, you do not go by 2. There should be a penalty for that. But I also wanted to speak to this statement coming in from NATCOMS, that's the National Association of Telecommunications Subscriber. Yeah. They are saying that it is either a 10 to 15% increase, or it's going to be a court case. And I'm wondering, does 10 to 15% suffice for this sector?
To be honest, and when I deal with questions like this, it makes me want to sound insensitive, right? But there's absolutely no reason why you want to go on the streets, for instance, for the labor union to call on strike because telcos have raised prices. There's no reason, to waste your money going to court to challenge, a 50% hike in telco fees, and you want it brought down to 10%. It'll just be a waste of your time. The reality is, and for want of a better word, the reality is they are dealing with the same economic reality that most businesses are dealing with. You've had to pay almost 2 times more for the fees of your kids. You buy food is at 40% inflation, and that's on paper. But when you go to the market, you pay 2-3 times more for a tuber of yam that you used to buy barely a year ago. So these are the realities that we deal with. It's a bit pretentious to expect that, somehow these telcos are insulated from this reality and they make so much money, for instance, that, it will cushion them from, the reality of a high inflationary environment, stockflation, if you even asked me, right? So I'm tired of this, let's go to court, let's protest, let's do this. It's a waste of time. Hold the regulator to account to demand better quality service, for the services that they are rendering. And that way, we perhaps will get some sort of cost savings at the end of the day when we do the calculations going forward. Listen, will it impact small businesses? Yes, it would. Will it diminish consumer spending? Yes, it would. Would it leave little discretionary income for households? Yes, it would. Would it raise, household expenditure? Yes, it would. Just like household expenditure has been raised with the hike of electricity bills and petrol and all sorts of things. So, that's the reality of the economy that has been delivered to us, in the last 8 to 10 years. And except we fix the larger macroeconomic fundamentals, haggling over, such price increases will just be a bit of a waste of time, if you ask me, really and truly.
So I was listening to an analyst, I think was it yesterday or 2 days ago. He was talking about some incentives, some coming from the government angle and some coming from, again, still the government angle, maybe NCC, saying, look, for calls to maybe banks, to telecommunications, sometimes you're charged for these calls, and perhaps it can become toll-free, just so that, because those are most of the calls that people make, customer service calls, and perhaps it should be made toll-free in a way that takes off the burden. So every other call you're making, a personal, business, but that customer service call can be toll-free.
That's a brilliant point. And it goes back to the point I've been making all day long, which means the government has to be the one that is providing these sets of incentives. You could say, for instance, we are going to lower, your corporate taxes. We're going to lower, XYZ, give you XYZ concessions and things like that. So the chips, really and truly, in terms of determining better value for the consumer and determining lower spending for the consumer, all of the chips are with the federal government. So it's what they choose to play that will matter at the end of the day. And I think it's a brilliant idea, if you asked me, as well as many others that they can do. So that's why I want us to push the responsibility more to the government, because they have more cards to play in terms of getting these telco providers to provide cheaper services, to the Nigerian people than the businesses themselves absorbing that extra costs. Government can give you tax credits, they can give you tax waivers, they can do all sorts of things, for you to lower entire corporate cost or operating expenses. And that way they can pass that down, to the consumers. So our regulators now need to concentrate on the fact that consumers are getting value for what they pay for. Today, as we speak, you buy, in quote, yogurt drinks that are as watery, as water that runs down from your tap. You buy products in sachets where half of what you find in that sachet is just air blown away. You don't even find the biscuits or the sweets, inside what has been packaged. So these are the things for me that the regulator should focus on, ensuring that consumers are not such changed even when they are paying higher prices. Because you're paying higher prices for the biscuits that you're buying, but it's smaller, the quality has dropped significantly, and things like that. So that for me should where the energy should be dissipated on.
All right, so we'll continue this conversation in just a moment, but we need to interrupt our lineup of programming as we cross over to Ogun State to bring you the live transmission of the Christ Apostolic Grammar School 65th anniversary and a mega reunion. This program will continue on YouTube and our UK channel, but those on DSTV will watch a live transmission from Ogun State.
Omoba Dapo Abiodun
is a word of testimony.
Thank you. Omoba Dapo Abiodun tí wọ́n jẹ́ gómìnà wa ẹ ṣé àdúpẹ́ bẹ́ẹ̀ náà ni.
Good morning, Marina Station and all the passengers. Efficient, it's comfortable.
This development will go a long way in reducing congestion and emission.
The trains are a long-term solution to Lagos traffic challenges.
This is where we take the final,
The government can begin to, because they are taking a hit with tariff, electricity tariff, with telecoms tariff, with cost of fuel. That's a lot for somebody running a salon, whether barbing salon or for men or styling, hair styling for women. What sort of incentives do you think the government can put in place, especially for small businesses?
Over the top of my head, I recall what I would argue was the most brilliant initiative from the Buhari administration, which never even got implemented. Anyway, they started some sort of employment benefit program. I can't remember what they called it at the time. But businesses, especially small businesses, were supposed to apply to the federal government to tell them how many staff that you have, and the government will take on the payment of the salaries of 2 of those people just to keep them in the job. I thought that was a brilliant initiative, and I think it's something that the Tinubu administration can borrow and seek ways to implement, because if you are going to pay the salaries of 1 or 2 people in a small business, it keeps that business going. It gives them the chance to grow. It gives them the chance to raise their productivity, and it gives them the chance to weather the storm that they currently are dealing with at the moment, and it gives them a chance of significant growth, which means that in the mid to long term, that businesses will not just survive, it will grow and employ more people. So that for me is one initiative that I think that the federal government can reconsider and bring back. That way you wouldn't have a situation where a lot of more businesses are folding up because they can't pay salaries, or you have businesses that have to lay off staff because they have to deal with other costs that have gone up and they can't afford to pay salaries. That for me is one of the things that I think that will really make a lot of sense if they can find a way to implement, rather than just throwing all of these monies that they throw on cash transfer programs that really doesn't stick, we can't track, we can't measure, and it's had no impact whatsoever on the economy. If we can guarantee that we keep people in their jobs and we keep them paying salaries, and then the expected outcomes of those businesses to reinvest in the growth of that business, and we can track those businesses whose staff are being paid from the federal government, I think that that will be a more pragmatic and sensible initiative to implement going forward.
I mentioned earlier that we spoke with the CEO of MTN Nigeria, and he has said that the implementation will begin this week. I know that a lot, again, we're going to see reactions on social media as to how much people, because I just imagine people looking at the data price and, screaming. But it's going to happen, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
People should brace up for it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
The CEO and Managing Director, Adio Strategy and Communications, Ayodele Adio. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
I will take a break now. When we return, we'll turn attention